Good evening and welcome to the new BUGAJSKI Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And we will be examining important global, regional and local developments that affect the lives of all Kosovars. I will be discussing important questions with a major political player, and my guest today on the BUGAJSKI hot seat in the US Department of State is the head of the South Central European or West Balkan office, Tom Yazgerdi. But first, my political commentary on an important international topic, which is entitled Washington's West Balkan Commitments. Persistent doubts remain about American commitments to those Balkan states that are still vulnerable to instability and conflict and have not achieved European Union membership. For the Barack Obama administration, the Balkans are largely a historical footnote, rather than a pressing policy challenge. Conflicts and crises in the Middle East and East Asia are of much more direct concern than the prospect of renewed Balkan disputes. Balkan fatigue is compounded by Europe fatigue, with the conclusion that Brussels and Berlin must provide the leadership and muscle in the region rather than Washington. The US State Department wants to play a supportive role while signaling that America is no longer the supervisor who will automatically come to the rescue. During the past year, senior officials dealing with Europe have been preoccupied with the crisis in Ukraine and reassuring nearby NATO members that the US will protect them from Russia's aggression. Nonetheless, Washington maintains three priorities for the region: completing the map of democracies, fostering infrastructure and energy connectivity, and combating an assortment of transnational threats. Democratization remains the core belief among American policymakers, as they are convinced that this stabilizes countries and ultimately makes them productive. But formal democracy without full political accountability and the rule of law remains insufficient. The Greek debacle also demonstrated how a relatively strong democracy became a weak state because of mismanagement, corruption and clientelism. Having invested in the Western Balkans for over 20 years, the US wants to present the region as a success story and a showcase for democracy and free markets to countries in the Middle East and beyond. Washington is also focused on energy diversity for Europe, because it views Russian monopolization as a threat to regional security and to national independence. Hence, Belgrade is being urged to diversify its gas supply routes and not be fully dependent on Russia. The US is backing the Southern Corridor project with Azerbaijan and Turkey, with increasing supplies of Caspian Basin gas entering the European market. And according to Washington, combating corruption and crime through legislative and judicial reform must remain high on the Balkan agenda. Official corruption fosters political abuse, in which Macedonia has become a negative showcase. Democratic backsliding endangers stability and can increase conflicts with neighbors. Unfortunately, the US administration has done too little in unblocking the Greek veto on Macedonia's progress into the EU and NATO, a policy that contributes to regional instability. US officials also want Brussels and Berlin to undercut Russia's pernicious influences, whether these are generated through energy contracts, propaganda campaigns, corrupt business deals, or nationalist conflicts that undermine perspectives for EU enlargement. Given Washington's limited engagement in the Western Balkans, one wonders what would convince the White House about the necessity for closer involvement. The one stark possibility would be a crisis that the EU could not handle, such as an outbreak of violence that threatens state survival or challenges existing borders. Be careful what you do not wish for. Good evening again. It is time now for the BUGAJSKI Hot Seat, and our special guest today from the US Department of State is Tom Yazgardi, who is the head of the South Central Europe or West Balkan office at State. And again, Tom, thank you very much for hosting us at the department.
To see you again, yeah.
It's good to be back. It's always good to be back. And I'd like to thank also VOA for helping to host the show here. Now, before we zero in on Kosovo, because this is the sort of main interest of our viewership, I wanted to look at the bigger region, the bigger picture. I mean, you're responsible for the wider region. I don't mean responsible for the problems, responsible for trying to find solutions for the wider region. So let me start with some recent developments. I mean, in recent weeks and months, we've seen demonstrations and protests against alleged government abuses in Macedonia. We've seen protests in Montenegro against alleged corruption by the government. And we've seen, of course, in Kosovo, protests in parliament, primarily against the agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, which is interpreted in a certain way by the opposition. Are all these events related, would you say? Is there some sort of common thread? Because, you know, I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but I'm always asked, Balkans are falling apart again. Is there a common thread in this?
I don't think so, Janusz. I really don't. I think these are important. A number of the Balkan countries, in fact, all of them are facing significant issues. In Montenegro, for example, NATO accession is on the public plate, so to speak. There is some opposition, and those who wish to freely demonstrate against that policy of the government are free to do so. I think where you have to draw the line, like in any democracy, is for these demonstrations to be peaceful. And when they're not, of course, the government, the authorities have an obligation to protect people and property. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the issue there. In Macedonia, of course, we see the governing coalition and the opposition trying to come to agreement. Mm-hmm. We're very hopeful that they can. We're urging both sides to meet the Persiano agreements from July 15th, mm-hmm. And we're hopeful that will be the case. And in Kosovo, of course, we see an opposition which is protesting ostensibly against perhaps the dialogue agreements and the border demarcation agreement with Montenegro. Again, these are what we see in Kosovo that's worrisome is tear gas in the parliament, which really has no place. You can demonstrate, you can protest, you can express your opposition or support, as the case may be, but mm-hmm. actually stopping the work of the assembly, an institution of Kosovo, is really unacceptable. I think that's true in any democracy, mm-hmm. Especially a young democracy like Kosovo's. So I don't really think there's a thread. I just think there are countries sort of confronting important issues in their history, some historical issues, really.
Right. When I say thread, I mean I don't necessarily mean that there's a single hand behind it, although I've had those sort of conspiracies as well. But let's face it, I mean the region is going through economic stagnation, in some cases poverty, let's say stagnant living standards, low employment. We saw the refugee crisis. There were many Albanians and Kosovars that were headed towards Germany. So is this a factor that some of these groups, some of the protesters can actually exploit, the factor of economic distress?
I think that's the case. You're right, there have been folks from the Balkans actually transiting migrating from the region to EU countries. And I think that's absolutely true. I think that it can be exploited. But I think the governments of the region have to sort of keep their eye on the prize. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen, for example, in Kosovo, is the signing of the Stabilization Association Agreement mm-hmm. Just earlier this week or last week. That's a great accomplishment, yeah. And one that we hope will actually translate into greater prosperity for the people of Kosovo. Mm-hmm. It might not exactly trickle down tomorrow, but I think with greater trade opportunities and all the benefits that the SAA brings, mm-hmm. Hopefully that will limit the sort of the migration out of a place like Kosovo, because that is of concern. Mm-hmm. And we have seen some of the migrants from Kosovo taking advantage of the general migration crisis from Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere.
You know, it's also, I think, a question of frustration with some of the politicians, the corruption that people see, the lack of accountability, let's say, of some officials. Would you say that's a common factor as well in the region?
I think that's true, and that's really one of the things that our Assistant Secretary, Toria Newland, has really keyed on in the region, to address sort of ingrained corruption in the region, which is a huge issue. I think, you know, people see that every day when they need a piece of paper from whatever the case may be, a driver's license or from their local authorities, on up until large-scale corruption. That is something that has to be combated. It's not something that is, of course, just limited to the Balkans. We have it in every country, including the United States. But I think it's something that we want to see addressed, and addressed in a way that can actually bring the confidence of citizens back. In Albania, for example, I know they're discussing decriminalization of the parliament. They're looking at judicial reform that has an anti-corruption aspect to it. These are important efforts that we think are absolutely essential to get that trust of the citizens back in their government, whether whoever's in power, because I don't think corruption knows one party or another. We see it sort of across the board of the Balkans. So I think that's it's a difficult issue to attack. You're dealing with some entrenched interests, sometimes with hand in hand with organized crime. But I think it's something that, in my own personal experience, I think we're starting to finally address in the Balkans. I think the United States was interested in stability at first in the Balkans, which we of course still are. But I think we've moved beyond that now to the point where we can address some of the underlying aspects that have been difficult in the past to get to, and one of those is anti-corruption.
And in fact, long-term stability, long-term security sometimes means a little bit of instability, rocking the boat to reform institutions.
That's right. You're asking entrenched sort of institutions, personalities, to change the way business is done. And of course, you're going to rock the boat. But I think if you have the people behind you, which I think is the case, you can actually show some progress. You can actually make some difference.
People often ask me, why is it the Albanians do so well when they leave the country, and why are they so stifled when they're in the country?
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
Well, I think part of it is sort of the difficult situation that people do find themselves in Albania, and dealing with some of these entrenched interests and the way of doing business, where when they do come to a country like the United States, not that we are the be-all and end-all of prosperity and anti-corruption, but I think there's more opportunity too. I think there's more opportunity. So people, I think, are a bit freer to express themselves, whether you know, sort of creatively or in the business sense. And I think that's why you see the creativity among Albanians, certainly in the New York restaurant business in New York. You see the ability to do very well. But I think that's true across the board for a lot of immigrants from the Balkans.
Right. Well, let me turn to, you mentioned already the European Union. Obviously, the EU, in a way, has the lead role in the region because all these countries do aspire to European Union membership and have certain criteria to meet. You mentioned the Stabilization Association Agreement that Kosovo's finally got. Long overdue, but better late than never. I would say, I will ask you this, in terms of promoting these essential reforms, justice system, law enforcement, disconnecting business from politics, that's how I would put it in terms of anti-corruption. Is the EU doing enough, would you say? Is the conditionality and the implementation enough?
Yeah, it's a hard question to ask. I think we in the EU see eye to eye on that. I really do. I think they realize that the EU accession process, if it's taken seriously, which I think it is by the countries of the region, will ultimately lead to a situation where corruption will be less prominent, play less of a role in the lives of citizens. Again, even on a basic level of trying to get some permission from a local authority. I think that is important. We support that 100%. And I think, by the way, I'll take again the case of Albania, which of course is a EU candidate country.
Sure.
There, I think they still have to meet before a key chapter is open some serious benchmarks, anti-corruption benchmarks and others, and we see eye to eye with the EU on that. It's absolutely essential that that both parties, the ruling party and the opposition party, agree to that, and I think that's fully in line with Albania's EU aspirations. So I think I think they recognize, our EU colleagues recognize the importance of fighting anti-corruption. We share information with them, they share with us, and I think that's a big part of getting to the point where you can open a key chapter.
In terms of Kosovo, for our viewership specifically in the country, the SAA process is just another step on the ladder, but it's an important step. At least you're on the ladder. What would you say? What would be your message to people in Kosovo who maybe have too high expectations about this, assuring EU membership, which is of course a long-term process? How would you envisage that timetable? How would you describe it?
Well, I think I think the successful dialogue agreements that Kosovo signed with Serbia has resulted in the EU recognizing that progress, recognizing Kosovo and Serbia are interested in normalizing relations, and as such has, in a sense, said that Kosovo is ready now, with that ability to conclude these agreements, ready for the SAA. And so I think it's a long process. It's frustrating. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next year. But I think you have to start somewhere. Yeah. And I think that's a milestone, which means you have a start point now, and a start point means eventually an end point. So they're on the road. There's a lot more hard work ahead, but I think in general, this is something that every country's had to go through, and I think it may not be readily apparent for the people of Kosovo right now, but I think it will bring benefits, and it'll bring greater stability, I think. I think also economically, it'll open up some markets for Kosovo products. You'll get the European Union more interested in helping Kosovo meet the standards that it needs to meet in order to get to the next process, which of course will be opening the accession chapter itself.
In terms of what has often been called Euro fatigue, do you see that dissipating or increasing? We had this huge wave of refugees this summer, which may affect public perceptions and of course parliamentary perceptions, and the parliaments have to ratify membership of any new country. Do you think this could set back the process?
Well, I think it sort of ebbs and flows, and I think we might perhaps be in a more of an ebb period right now, given the fears, and to be quite frank, some of the more extreme political parties in the EU, within the EU countries, have tried to take advantage of. But I think when all is said and done, there really is no other organizing principle for the Balkan region than Euro-Atlantic integration, EU integration particularly. I think, as I said, you may see some times when it's more attractive, sometimes when it's less attractive on both sides. But I think in terms of an alternative, there really isn't any alternative. I think this is a part of Europe. It's an area where I see in the future all countries being a member of the European Union. They all have that as their stated goal. So again, we have to just get through some of the tough times, and of course it is affected by how the EU itself deals with these problems, the migration issue in particular. But I think when all is said and done, there really isn't any alternative or different organizing principle for the region than further EU integration, and I'm confident that'll be the case.
In terms of Kosovo's potential membership, presumably before the country gains membership, the remaining 5 states that haven't recognized Kosovo would have to recognize it. Because ratification, I think, has to be across the board.
I suppose that's true. I think, I guess Kosovo and Serbia will cross that bridge when they come to it. I think at this point, though, what's important to keep in mind is the two governments in power are interested in continuing the dialogue. They're interested in concluding agreements that actually improve the practical life of citizens in Kosovo. That's important, both whether you're ethnic Albanian or ethnic Serb or anything else. I think that's important, and that for me has been the big breakthrough since the Brussels Agreement was signed in 2013. So regardless of I would call it the high politics of what happens in the future with 5 non-recognizing members of the EU, what's important is what Serbia and Kosovo are doing right now on the ground in the region to improve relations, to increase stability, and the most important thing, improve the lives of its people. both peoples.
In a way, paradoxically, the opposition in Kosovo claimed that Kosovo's path to the EU should not be dependent on Serbia, but it works both ways, because in a way Serbia's path also depends on Kosovo. But the question I had there, though, is maybe you could explain to our viewers let's say why the protests began in the parliament. In other words, over the agreement, particularly regarding the Serb municipalities agreement within Kosovo. If you could explain what is this, because unfortunately there's this fear that's been engendered that this is going to create another Bosnia-Herzegovina, another entity system. Can you address that?
Yeah, I don't. First of all, I don't think that's the case, and I think. Perhaps the opposition in Kosovo is getting some bad information, because that is not the case. It's in line with the Ahtisaari plan, which I would remind some of the members of the opposition they actually agreed with, they actually signed on to. This is not going above and beyond that. This has been a red line for the Kosovo government, this association of Serb municipalities be fully in line with Kosovo law. I think that's important to recognize. It's not an easy thing to do. It isn't. You know, the wounds of the war are still sometimes a bit fresh, and they're easily sort of poked at. But I think when all is said and done, it's important to recognize that this is something that Kosovo itself committed to. Part of the dialogue, it was a product of negotiation. There are certain things that I'm sure Belgrade wanted to include that they weren't able to get. There were certain things that Kosovo wanted to include that it wasn't able to get. But the end product was something they both could live with. They both could agree on. And I think it speaks to Kosovo's credibility that they are going to go ahead and implement this, and that's important. So I think the opposition, unfortunately, is either not well informed or they're using it for other purposes, and that I think is dangerous.
For what purposes would you say?
I don't know, to try to score some political points, you know, to try to improve their standing, appeals to populism. I don't know. I don't know their motivation. All I do know is that this is fully in line with what Kosovo has agreed to in the past. It was a product of negotiation, and it was a difficult negotiating process for both sides. But it is something that the Kosovo government, with our full support, with the support of of Brussels, of the EU-led process, of the dialogue, that we fully support, and we want to see implemented by both sides.
During my last show, interview in Pristina, I interviewed the leaders of the four major parliamentary parties, the two major government parties, two major opposition parties. One of the, let's say, gripes or accusations of the opposition was that Parliament wasn't fully consulted in terms of the agreement, this specific agreement. How does that process work? Do they need to be fully consulted before the governor of Pristina signs something in Brussels?
Well, I think the dialogue team was fully empowered by the government to be able to negotiate with their Serbian counterparts. You know, the government is, I'm certain, was willing to explain the position, the reasoning behind it, but before that could have happened, I think you had tear gas in the parliament and the willingness to obstruct and not talk. And I think that's the issue. I'm certain the government would have every reason and every desire to want to inform the populace of what these agreements are about. That's normal, and there should be a healthy debate. But there's a difference between that and keeping the business of the people from being done by stopping the functioning of the assembly. That really is unacceptable. I think that no country would accept that sort of situation. So that's what concerns us a great deal, is that if you have concerns, you have questions, comments, fine, let's hear them, put them on the table. But to resort to violence, I mean, thank God no one was hurt, seriously hurt in these episodes. By all means, you should be able to express those concerns, those desires, those comments, but to do so in a way that's non-violent.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I mean, tear gas, if you have some heart condition or something else, it can be quite dangerous. Absolutely. In an enclosed space. But it does indicate, I suppose you could say, the degree of passion that's been unleashed by this. They argue, particularly leaders of Vetevendosje argue, this is the thin end of the wedge to partition or two-entity system or federalization of Kosovo. Can you put those, let's say, suppositions to bed, as we say in England?
Yeah, I really don't think there's anything to them, to either partition or federalization. again, these agreements, including the Association of Serbian Municipalities, was in line with Kosovo law. They were the product of long negotiation and determination, an agreement by the Kosovo side. They considered all these things. And so to say that this process will lead to that outcome, I think, is just specious. I don't think it's true. And again, if there are some legitimate concerns, questions, let's hear them. But we don't hear them. Instead, what we hear is just, you know, protest. Thank God they didn't then violently, I'm talking even outside the assembly or inside where someone could have gotten hurt. So again, if the opposition has these, let's hear what they have to say. Let's sit down and let the parliament meet and talk.
Well, my argument actually was to them was, why on earth would Washington and Brussels want to create another dysfunctional state in the region?
That's exactly right.
I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The struggle we've had with Bosnia over the past few years, certainly don't want that repeated in Kosovo.
No. And it won't be in Kosovo. It won't be. I just think anyone that argues that somehow the dialogue agreements will lead to that, I think is just misinformed or using it for other purposes.
The other question I'm always asked is, when will Serbia recognize Kosovo's independence? How long would that process take?
You know, it's hard to say. Again, to be honest with you, academics or others can discuss that. But what's important is that Serbia is willing to sit down with Kosovo to discuss practical agreements. And we salute Serbia for that. We know it's not an easy thing to do. We know, given the history and the obvious, you talk about passion, Janusz, the obvious passion that still infuses that argument in Serbia. But I think cooler heads have prevailed in a very rational, good way. And so I think that will be addressed at some point in the future, I imagine. But what needs to be done now is to build, first of all, implement what the two sides have agreed to, and also then think about what else, dialogue, let's call it phase 2. What are the other agreements that can actually improve the lives of the people in Kosovo? Actually, and peoples on both sides of the border, to be quite honest, because it adds to stability, not only for those two countries, but the region. That, I think, is the more important question. What can be done by implementing these agreements and agreements in the future that can improve the lives of people? That's, for me, the most important question.
When you say both sides of the border, would it also involve, and there's been some comparison of the situation of the Albanian population, particularly in the Preševo Valley, is there going to be, let's say, more focus on improving their participation in Serbian political structures in the same way that Serb minority can participate in Kosovo's political structure?
I think we have to be a little bit careful there, because the case of Kosovo was a sui generis case. It was based on the Ahtisaari plan. I know that talking to my colleagues who work in Preševo with the OSCE and other organizations, there are structures within the Serbian political system in which the Albanian minority and other minorities can actually, the national minority councils, for example, where they can express themselves. But I think we have to be careful to try to compare the two situations. Kosovo was a very unique situation in which the United Nations, for the first time in its history, actually administered the province of a country. That is unprecedented.
Sure.
So, in fact, I just had the Preševo mayors here a few weeks ago, Bujanovac and Preševo, and I met with them, and they raised that same issue. And I said to them, look, it's entirely appropriate to want to advocate for greater rights as you see them. But be careful about comparing the situation in Preševo with the situation in Kosovo. They're two distinct issues, situations and places.
Why are they distinct? What would be the key factors?
I would just say the history, the degree to which the United Nations was involved, the fact that an envoy, Mati Ahtisaari, was appointed and came to his conclusions. I think it's a very different situation than what was experienced in Preševo. There wasn't the same level of, to be quite honest, of violence.
I was going to say, they didn't try to expel.
No, exactly. So that's what I mean by the two situations. You need to be careful if you try to compare them.
Fully agree. And how does that, let's say, the situation in Macedonia, which we're always watching very carefully, not only because of the recent abuses, but the position of the Albanian population, its commitment to that political structure, the implementation of the Ohrid Framework Agreement and so on. How would you compare that situation to Kosovo?
Well, again, a different situation. I think the government and the governing coalition, the ethnic Albanian parties, they've been able to find common cause in using the Oakwood Framework Agreements. Does it mean that everything that the Oakwood Framework Agreements stipulated has been done? Probably not. Probably not. But I think at least what it did, it not only ended the armed conflict in Macedonia, but it provided a framework by which the Albanian community in Macedonia could further integrate. Is it exactly how we want to see that country? No. But does it provide a framework by which you can actually further integrate the Albanian community in Macedonia? Yes, we think it does. I think a lot of it requires political will, greater understanding, and I think sort of at the community level, at sort of the most basic level, of having the two communities, get to know each other a bit more and accept each other a bit more. And so I think again, I think we need to see the situation of the Albanian minorities, whether it's in Macedonia or Serbia or Montenegro. They're distinct situations. Sure. They're not all painted with the same brush.
Right.
And each community has different challenges, different issues, different stresses. And so
different experiences with the government and so forth.
Different historical experiences. So I think we have to be careful in trying to lump them all together and saying, well, it's all the same, because it's not.
Going back again to Kosovo and the boycott of parliament, which I personally believe is a blockade of democracy, you could put it. But for the public looking at this, does it not increase their disillusionment with institutions? That these institutions, we elected these guys, they don't function, they don't even allow legislation to be passed. Isn't this a danger that there could be this disassociation from citizenry from institutional?
No, I think that's right, and I think if if it continues in this way, that disillusionment will probably grow, and that's what I think is a danger. You can criticize the Kosovo Assembly, you can criticize the government, that's fine. That's the work of an opposition. I think that's a healthy sign of a democracy, but trying to limit by violence debate and the functioning of an institution, as imperfect as it is, as imperfect as ours is in the United States, is just unacceptable and wrong. And I think we all have to stand up and say that's enough. That has to stop.
And I've even heard from some people, maybe those who don't know the region that well, but those that may have a political agenda would say, well, Kosovo is a failing state. And that serves the agenda of certain other powers.
I think that's probably right. I think those other powers would probably want to say that anyway, so they're looking for issues to point to say that Kosovo is a failing state. But it's not. It's it can be a thriving state, I think, if given the chance. And again, I think its future with this SAA as a first step in EU integration is sort of a like a ray of hope, I would say. And it's not an easy place. I served 3 years there. I know it's not an easy place, especially for young people. They're looking for opportunity, and it's difficult for them. But I think again, I go back to what I said before. You have to start somewhere, and you have to. I think this integration process, this first step, will provide for a greater stability for that place, which means probably greater foreign investment. Kosovo has a lot of challenges. It needs to, have a steady energy supply. As we know, we can talk about Kosovo Sea, which is a difficult issue. It needs rule of law. It needs a parliament that can meet without the opposition using violence. There's all sorts of challenges, but I think I still think there's the political will on the part of the citizens there to build their state, and I think that won't change.
I think also very interesting, the opposition did take part in the SAA vote, which indicates that all sides are committed to EU integration, which is a real positive, I think, for the...
I think that was good to see. That was good. Now, if that would translate into allowing the Assembly to operate freely, I think that would be even better.
Does Kosovo face political and social instability in the long term, would you say? I mean, do we need to be worried in Washington?
I think, I think we want to make certain that Kosovo has the opportunities to sort of, as I said, allow its people to build their state. That means, a clear economic sort of vision for that country. You know, it's as I said before, it's a tough place, but I think if they're allowed to do this, and I think the indications are there's no reason why it can't, if we see this process of the dialogue deepened, we see Kosovo move forward on its EU path, we see greater regional integration, which we are seeing in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of Kosovo's acceptance into regional organizations, then I think Kosovo will do okay. I think it'll do just fine. But I think that requires a lot of attention. I think it requires a lot of negotiation. There are things that we know that Serbia is not happy about. We know about the UNESCO vote that's coming up on next Monday, I believe it is, next week. But I think when all is said and done, I think if those sort of elements are there for Kosovo, then it has a chance to actually thrive as a state. I believe that's true for the region. I mean, I've been accused of being too optimistic about the Balkans, but I think you have to be.
Sure.
You have to be. I think they have a skilled workforce, an educated workforce. There's no reason why Kosovo or any other country in the Balkans can't progress together. And I think the key thing is together. And finally, I think I said this to you before, Janusz, for me, at least now we're seeing the whole region moving together slowly and at different speeds, but moving together. That wasn't the case some years ago, as we know. So I think if they can get beyond, or they can rise above old rivalries and hatreds, which I think they have a very good chance of doing with the EU, as imperfect as that union is, but with the EU as sort of the guiding force, and to be honest with you, NATO as sort of the security force, then I think the region the future of the region is pretty much assured.
I would agree with you, regions moving together, except there's one part of the puzzle that doesn't seem to be moving in the same direction. That's Macedonia. And part of that, obviously, the government abuses, the let's say uncertainty about elections, and we may have the same government elected again anyway. But the blockade by Greece, effectively through the veto on NATO and EU accession because of the name dispute. Should America be more involved in this?
Well, we are. We're encouraging. You know, there's hopefully a process we think underway. You know, Minister Kotsias, the Greek foreign minister, visited the region a few months ago, and he visited Macedonia as well. And we're hopeful that the two sides are actually interested in engaging in confidence-building measures, which we hope could actually lead to greater understanding and resolution of the name issue. It is difficult. It has been difficult for Macedonia, but it's not impossible. There have been worse sort of long-standing issues that have been resolved in world politics. We think this can be resolved as well. There's no question. But it has been difficult for Macedonia. I think the best thing that the Macedonians could do now is to resolve their current political crisis by coming to agreement. They're very close, we've heard, by having a good electoral process next April. They've agreed to early elections. You know, they've agreed to a special prosecutor to investigate some of the allegations in the wiretap scandal. If they can actually do that, I think that will put lay to any or put to rest any concerns aside from the name issue. And I think that's probably the most important thing they probably could do at this point. Sure. But my government pushes very strongly both sides to come to terms on the name, and I think they can do it.
Going back to Kosovo, one other question I wanted to cover, which is this crackdown on radicalism, potential terrorism. Prime Minister Mustafa stated that this new strategy, including a law banning participation in foreign conflicts, will help plug Kosovo into the, let's say, campaign or struggle against international terrorism. Is there a danger that Kosovo could somehow become an IS target, an Islamic State target, as a result of the fact that there is this crackdown?
Well, I think there's always that's true of probably any state, I think, that takes measures, and not just Kosovo. But I think it's important that you know, I think you need to deal with the issue not out of fear but out of conviction, and I think that's what Prime Minister Mustafa is trying to do, and we support that very strongly. He sees a problem, he sees an issue. We provided some support to him, some technical expertise to try to deal with the issue. You know, and I think again, you just have to you have to do what you have to do. And that's important, regardless of whether you might become a potential target of ISIL or anybody else. So I think he's doing the right thing. I think we're trying to help him with best practices. You know, and this is not just, you know, something limited to Kosovo. It's a regional issue as well. We see, you know, the amount of the number of foreign fighters on a per capita basis is pretty high from the Balkans. So it is of concern. And the good news is that you know, at the UNGA we had this high-level countering violent extremism summit, and the Balkan countries were represented, well represented. So I think this is a regional issue that that all have to take seriously, and to present a sort of a united front. And I think Kosovo is doing that. And
presumably to address the recruitment program of some of the jihadists in these countries.
That's true.
Are there programs being developed to help, let's say, local imams, to help the Muslim community to, let's say, expose some of these radical elements?
Yeah, I think the whole idea behind, and I have a little bit of experience from this because I actually served in Afghanistan, in Kabul, where the problem was at a much greater degree, as you can imagine. I think the whole idea behind countering violent extremism, CVE as it's known, is it's multifaceted. It's not just law enforcement, although that's important. It's not just passing the laws in Parliament, although that's important too. It's working with local communities. It's looking at what imams are telling people. What are they saying in their Friday night prayers? Are they encouraging this kind of extremist? And if so, why? Do young people have opportunities? You know, what do they do after school? You know, are they able to find work when they graduate from high school or college? So it's we are working with the Kosovo government, not just the Kosovo government, but countries in the region and around the world that have issues, similar issues of recruitment of potential jihadists. So we are really taking that seriously in a multifaceted way.
But presumably you wouldn't agree with the supposition that somehow the Balkans are a breeding ground for terrorism, which I hear from some commentators in the West.
No, I think it's unfair and inaccurate. I think there's an issue that they're dealing with, but to say it's a breeding ground for terrorism, I think, is unfair.
Well, you know, this idea which Moscow has promoted, this green crescent between Bosnia stretching through the Albanian territories all the way to Chechnya.
Yeah.
So
yes, we don't agree with that.
A mythical construct, yeah. Well, let me ask you, actually, quite naturally, we're turning to Russia. In addition to international terrorism, we are witnessing a more aggressive, assertive Russian role in many regions, including the Balkans. Threats against NATO and EU enlargement. We see this in Montenegro. Prime Minister Djukanovic has complained about this negative Russian influence. We see it in propaganda, disinformation, social networks, fostering of political and ethnic divisions, accusing the US of conducting colored revolutions, maybe even in Macedonia. Should Kosovo be concerned? I mean, it's surrounded. There's no Russian influence as such in the Albanian-speaking world, but in a way they're surrounded by Russian pressures, Russian, let's say, subversive activities around the region. How should this be addressed?
Well, I think, you know, for example, you mentioned Montenegro, and there was probably some definite influence, Russian influence on the protests. But I think, you know, we look at some of the polling that's been done, and actually support for NATO is inching up. And I think that's important. The government has done a good job in trying to explain what NATO membership means to its populace. And I think, I'm confident that as we get closer to December, when an invitation might be offered, I think those poll numbers will go up even higher. And so I think the government is doing the right thing, and that is it's letting folks protest. I mean, there are some folks who are just opposed to NATO. That's okay. They can protest, and the key thing is, again, not violently. And when there was violence, I think the government reacted in a way that that was measured for the most part. So I think you know, we have to look at Russian influence in the Balkans. Again, we discussed this before, not in any way to sort of, I think, get panicky about it, but to recognize what it is, and to recognize, you know, I think not to keep in mind what the end result, the end game is, which is EU enlargement, EU integration, NATO enlargement for those countries that want it. And I think, again, that's the organizing principle. You talk about Russian energy interests in the Balkans, of which, if you look at the different countries, they're affected in different ways. Some are more dependent, some are less dependent. I think our concern is the as the government, I think this is shared by the EU, is to make certain that no one is dependent on any one country or any one source. I think you want to diversify.
Right.
That's why we're encouraging Croatia, and they agree with it, the development of the LNG terminal, whether it's a floating terminal or one onshore. The interconnectors, between Greece and Bulgaria, for example, and then Serbia. These are important things that would reduce boost dependence, and basically keep at bay any desire by Russia or anybody else to try to influence the situation there in a way that's not helpful or supportive of those countries' sort of stated desires for Euro-Atlantic integration. For Kosovo, I don't think we have to worry much about pro-Russian influence in Kosovo, but I think it is something to watch, it's something to bear in mind, but not to get overly panicky about, to address the issues where they exist, and I think the governments by and large are doing that.
Maybe it's too early to talk about it, but something that just occurred to me, you mentioned NATO membership for Montenegro, possibly for the next round. When will Kosovo become a member of NATO?
Well, we know that they would like to become a NATO member tomorrow, but I think there's some things they still have to do. Obviously, they still have to. There's this whole idea to transform the security force to the Kosovo Armed Forces, and they know what they have to do. It's not an easy thing, and that is to make certain that the Kosovo Serbs feel secure about that and that they agree with it. And so if that is Kosovo's stated desire, which I'm sure it is, there's a lot of steps that would have to be done before that would come to fruition. And I think the Kosovo leadership understands that, not just with Kosovo Serbs, but I think making certain that it's not a threat to anyone, which I don't think it would be, but to make certain that it's a sort of organic process that develops in a way that makes sense.
And Serbia itself at some point may wish to join. I mean, I know Defense Ministry and members of the military would like to be part of the most modern and sophisticated military force, not to be somewhere in the wilderness or linked with, let's say, an obsolete Russian military. So presumably the whole region eventually, our policy is to involve the whole region, to bring the whole region into NATO.
Well, I think it's obviously a decision for the Serbian government, the Serbian people to make. We already do, NATO already does have a relationship with Serbia in the so-called Individual Partnership Action Plan, which is good. We would encourage Serbia to consider exercises with NATO if they want to see how NATO operates, how countries work together in NATO. But again, that's a decision for the Serbian government and the Serbian people to make.
Right. Very last question, Tom, because we're running out of time. How would you explain the US commitment now to the Balkans? Obviously, the EU has taken the lead role. The key part of EU foreign policy is actually to bring these countries into the fold, into the organization. What is the US role? Because I hear from some people, the US isn't interested anymore, it's in the background somewhere. Tell us how you see it.
We have an abiding interest in the Balkans. I think that was clear from our involvement, intervention in the Balkan Wars. We hope we never have to intervene like that ever again, and I don't think we will. But I think as we see it, it is a EU-led process, and we see ourselves in a strong supportive role for that. Because none of the countries of the Balkans are going to be the 51st state. Although if you had a referendum in Kosovo, that might not be the case. But seriously, I think they all are going to be members of the EU at one point. So we want to make certain that we're in lockstep with our EU colleagues. We don't always see eye to eye, but we have a very good.
Maybe next interview I'll ask you where you don't see eye to eye.
Okay, but I think we see ourselves supporting that very important process of economic prosperity as sort of identified or by the European Union as the way ahead, and the security that NATO can provide. So I see a very strong collaboration between the United States and the European Union.
Great. Tom, thank you very much for joining me on the show, and I'm sure we'll have you back as conditions evolve in Kosovo and the region.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and my colleagues, both at RTK, but also here at VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. And see you all very soon in Pristina. Miru Pavšim.